10 years ago, a news story completely rocked the Linux and open source world. This was reported on everywhere, and the story was so truly bizarre that it boggled the mind. And the story was this: President Obama had declared that Linux users were political extremists that needed to get flagged for extra and additional surveillance by the NSA and other government agencies. Wild, right? This was back in 2014, and one of the big organizations that was targeted in this was Linux Journal magazine. So people who were on the Linux Journal forum or subscribers to the Linux Journal were political extremists. Obama declared them essentially an enemy, right? They were extremists that were dangerous and had to be watched. And at the time, I and so many other journalists were covering this. It was funny. It was peculiar. It was quirky. I mean, yes, it was a bad thing, but surely there must be a mistake here, right? This must be Linux users getting swept up in some sort of broad internet keyword search. Like they looked for words like, I don't know, crypto or Bitcoin or open source or whatever, and all of a sudden Linux users popped up a lot, so they just auto flagged them, right? It surely must be something that an automatic script did. But if you flash forward in time, from 2014 until now, what you see is a consistent and steadily increasing pattern. And this, I know this is going to get real political, but this is what is happening. And I can't think of other ways to describe it, but it is a concerted effort, a pattern, a long pattern of attacks from extreme leftists on open source. It's weird. It's really weird. And all of you out there, I'm sure, can come up with many additional theories upon why it is happening. But the fact of the matter is, it's happening. And one of the first big, great examples was that 2014 declaration that Linux users were political extremists that must be surveilled. I mean, looking back on it, that's almost a declaration of war. It's less a quirky, weird news story of an obvious mistake and more, yeah, we should have seen this coming. This was what they meant to do all along. It's absolutely fascinating. And just to give you a few examples, just a few, we saw just yesterday, news broke that the Linux kernel was being essentially hit by sanctions, right? Sanctions imposed by President Biden, a leftist, imposing sanctions that mean that GNU GPL software like the Linux kernel could no longer work with programmers from Russia, which resulted in the Linux kernel having to literally ban pages and pages of long-term key component maintainers of portions of the Linux kernel because President Biden on the left said you have to get rid of them, right? This is just the way it is. And we're going to see this happening a lot more over the coming weeks and months because there is a hard deadline for those sanctions to be implemented of, I think it's December 11th, 10th or 11th, something like that, where if they're not implemented by that point, then any organization, project, individual, foundation, company that has GPL software or other open source software under a variety of certain licenses will not be allowed to work with programmers, testers, documentation people, or anyone from Russia, right? So we start to see, you could look at this a whole lot of different ways, but the core thing here is this is an attack on open source. I mean, this is taking something that was global, something that was a distributed across the internet global enterprise, and saying, no, we're going to start dividing it up. And if you talk to the wrong people, you're going to jail, right? That's what leftists have declared. And now, again, you may like Russia, you may hate Russia, you may be for or against various wars that Russia's involved with. Irrelevant to this story. Focus instead on the fact that this was a leftist politician pushing forward in a way that directly harms open source and free software. And this isn't the only case of this. We're not just talking about politicians here. I mean, look at the case of NixOS earlier this year, where a group of individuals, all of whom were self-identified leftist extremists, in fact, some of them identified as communists, committed a purge of contributors to NixOS, even going so far as to force out the founder of the project, right? Group of leftists destroying an open source project. That's what happened, right? And this goes on and on and on. Ladybird, the Ladybird open source web browser. As soon as Ladybird was announced, it immediately got attacked. Who attacked it? Well, it was not people on the right. It was not people in the middle. It was not centrists. It was only extreme leftists. It's always extreme leftists attacking open source projects. Over and over again. Godot, the Godot game engine controversy that happened, where they enacted a mass cleansing of users. It was always, in the case of Godot, individuals who were extreme leftists purging and cleansing people who were not leftists from an open source project, thus causing a fairly extensive damage to the Godot game engine project, such that multiple forks started spinning off, a huge amount of bad press. I mean, it was just game developers jumping ship. It was a big deal. Massive damage to the Godot project, open source, by leftist individuals. This continues on and on. OpenSUSE literally declared that if you did not adhere to and publicly advocate for leftist political positions, you would be kicked out of the project, and that they hoped that you would not be welcome anywhere in the Linux or open source world. And that resulted in huge droves of people being banned and kicked out from their mailing lists, from their membership rolls, forced out entirely. But these were long-term voting members, including myself, by the way, who used to sit as an elected position on the OpenSUSE board. They banned me too, right? It was, again, extremist leftists attacking an open source project, sometimes their own, sometimes others, in a way that almost completely obliterates it. This goes on and on and on. And then we saw just this last week, this Stallman report hit piece that came out. This was just, if you go to stallman-report.org, I believe it is, you can go and read it, and it's essentially a long hit piece against Richard Stallman, the founder of the Free Software Foundation. And that particular piece ends with a list of essentially demands that that basically read like, if you are not an extreme leftist, you must abdicate your position within the Free Software Foundation or the GNU project and allow a leftist to come in and take over, right? It is an extreme leftist who wrote this particular piece. We now know who exactly wrote this piece. And it was an extreme leftist who wrote it to cause damage to a free software and open source organization and set of organizations and individuals. Over and over and over and over again. I mean, this is just a handful of examples. If you simply look back over like the Lunduke Journal news over the last year, you'll probably find a good 20 examples easily just from the last year of significant projects being attacked in this way. And there's a constant recurring pattern here. People on the hard left attacking Linux, open source, and free software over and over and over again. And this goes all the way up to the presidency level, which is crazy to me. Both President Biden and President Obama issued orders which caused exactly these sorts of attacks on open source. Obama declaring that Linux users were political extremists, that we were dangerous. That includes me, by the way. I was an editor for Linux Journal magazine, so I'm definitely looped into with that. And adding additional surveillance onto Linux users. Creepy, super creepy. And then you got President Biden issuing executive orders that, no matter how you read them, mean that GPL'd software, among many other open source licenses, must fall under the regulation of pretty stringent sanctions. And the damage to these open source projects is significant. I mean, it's very, very significant. So why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because a pattern has emerged, right? It's not a series of a couple of quinky dinks. It's not, loosely connected news stories. It's a clear and distinct pattern that has accelerated over time, but has always included the top level political officials within multiple countries. You can come up with examples where similar things have been done in Europe as well. And as well as individuals running projects, journalists, community managers within projects, basically top to bottom, people on the left attacking open source and free software in Linux. And what's fascinating here is you may say, well, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense because so many people within the open source and free software and Linux world are, by definition and by self-declaration, quite leftist politically. So what exactly is going on here? And honestly, I think that's a topic for another day. But what I think we need to be willing to recognize and point out now is that there are no centrists or right-leaning individuals, groups, politicians, etc., waging war on open source or Linux or free software. But there are almost too many to count on the leftist side of the spectrum engaging in that war. I mean, literally declaring Linux users as extremists is off the charts extreme. I mean, it's crazy. And having now seen that pattern, having now observed that pattern, when I look back now at the 2014 actions by President Obama, holy heavens. I mean, foreshadowing. We should have seen so much more coming than we did at the time. And so I think it's worth recognizing that without question, the greatest enemy to open source software, free software, specific open source projects like Linux and whatnot are leftist individuals and leftist ideology, because those are the groups and those are the individuals that are attacking it. I mean, we have to recognize that. Now, many people will yell at me and try to call me names because of this, and that's fine. They can do that all they wish. But the pattern still remains. It's a consistent, ongoing pattern, and it's going to continue. I guarantee you, based on the current trajectory and the increasing rate at which we see these attacks on open source organizations of varying sizes and types by leftist individuals or groups, it will continue, right? Guarantee you, it's rare that I have a week go by at the Lunduke Journal where I'm not reporting on another one. And it's, again, never a group of centrists. It's never a group of right-leaning folks. It's always extreme leftists, basically going in and bowling the china shop and destroying and tar and feathering and tarnishing and attacking and belittling and besmirching and declaring extremists and imposing sanctions. And if it's not one thing, it's another, right? It's constant. Will there be another one to report on by this time next week? Going on the track record, yeah. If not by next week, certainly by the week after. I mean, we're talking about a frequency here where the wavelengths are days apart at most. Sometimes they come in so often, I don't even get to report on some of them. Some of them still fall by the wayside because there's even bigger ones to report on the same day. So this is an ongoing thing. And I think when we see patterns like this happening, we have to recognize them. We have to state them. We have to document them and say, this is a pattern. Now, we can argue about the reasons for the pattern. We can argue about what the pattern will ultimately mean. We can argue about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. We can argue about what should or should not be done about them. But we still need to recognize the patterns as existing, simply to recognize truth. reality, because this is the reality we live in. We live in a reality where if there are open source projects, free software projects, and they grow large enough to attract significant developer contributions, users, financial attention, government attention, etc., it will almost undoubtedly get attacked by someone or some group that is politically extreme left. That is almost becoming an undisputed truth of the reality of running an open source project or company at this point. And that is fascinating. That is fascinating that is happening. And we need to recognize it. And we need to talk about it. And we need to understand why and talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and then figure out what to do about it. But first, we have to recognize the truth and be willing to say it. I will get attacked for saying this. I get attacked for saying all sorts of things. It's fine. It's a day that ends in Y, whatever. People are going to come after me on it, but I want people to note, as they come after me and attack me for saying these things, one thing that they will not do is disprove the pattern that is happening, right? And that is the core message of what I wanted to talk about today, is that pattern. It is undisputable. It is indisputable. And they will not, no matter how much they attack me, call me a Nazi, call me evil, an extremist, whatever, they will not dispute that pattern, right? So now, even if you are a leftist politically, that's fine. But this pattern still holds. And I challenge anyone to disprove this ongoing pattern, because I can't see how it could be disproved. Thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers over at lunduke.com, lunduke.locals.com. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.